The unforgiving heat of the Sonoran Desert bore down on the earth, creating shimmering mirages that danced over the asphalt. James Carter trudged along the empty stretch of highway, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust with every weary step. Behind him, his battered old car sat lifeless on the side of the road, a plume of steam curling from beneath its rusted hood. James sighed as he glanced back. The car, much like himself, was a relic of better days, sturdy, reliable, but worn thin by time and circumstance. James had spent most of his life fixing other people's cars and, in many ways, fixing their lives. As a black auto mechanic in a small southern town, he'd learned the value of hard work and the art of listening. Strangers and regulars alike would open up to him as he tinkered under hoods or patched up tires, their voices tinged with trust. Over time, James had become a quiet observer of humanity, his calloused hands a testament to both his labor and his resilience. Yet today, as he walked under the desert sun, even his enduring optimism felt tested. Up ahead, a glint of metal caught his eye, a car parked on the shoulder, its hood raised like a white flag of surrender. Beside it stood a woman, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she fanned herself with a folded piece of paper. Her movements were quick and agitated, the kind of frustration born from desperation. James approached cautiously, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Hey there, need a hand?" The woman startled slightly before turning to face him. Her blue eyes reflected both relief and wariness, though the latter faded quickly as she sized him up. "Oh, thank God," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I thought I'd be stuck out here forever." "What's going on?" James asked, stopping a respectful distance away. "I think it's the alternator," she replied, gesturing toward the open hood. "The car just died on me. I'm supposed to be in Tucson for a conference." But her voice trailed off as she glanced at the desolate horizon, her anxiety palpable. James nodded, his mechanic's instincts kicking in. "Let me take a look. I've got a few tools with me." He set his bag down on the cracked asphalt, kneeling by the engine. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the woman's elegant demeanor. She wore a light summer dress that swayed gently in the breeze, and though her smile was tinged with stress, it was warm and genuine. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice casual. "Rachel," she replied, her tone softening. "Rachel Bennett. Nice to meet you." "Rachel," James said, offering a small smile as he adjusted a bolt. "I'm James." For a moment, they fell into an easy rhythm, James diagnosing the issue while Rachel hovered nearby, occasionally asking questions or offering tools. It was the kind of interaction James was used to, one where his skills could make a tangible difference. Then, the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the calm. James straightened and turned, his heart sinking as he saw a patrol car pulling up beside them. The siren gave a brief wail before the vehicle stopped, the lights flashing insistently. A burly officer stepped out, his expression unreadable behind his mirrored sunglasses. "Everything okay here?" the officer asked, his gaze flicking between James and Rachel. "Yeah, I'm just helping her with her car," James replied evenly, keeping his tone neutral. The officer, whose name tag read Daniels, took a slow step closer. His posture was authoritative, the kind that made James's stomach tighten. It was a feeling he knew well, the unspoken suspicion, the weight of assumptions that always seemed to follow him. "You sure he's not bothering you?" "Ma'am," Daniels asked Rachel, his voice carrying an edge that made her bristle. "No, not at all," Rachel said quickly, her hands fluttering nervously. "He's been helping me. My car broke down, and I was stranded." Daniels didn't look convinced. "I'll need to see some ID," he said, his attention snapping back to James. James bit back the irritation bubbling inside him. This wasn't the first time he'd been asked to prove himself in a situation where others wouldn't have been questioned. Slowly, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his driver's license. Daniels examined it with the scrutiny of someone searching for a flaw. "Everything checks out," Daniels muttered begrudgingly, though his tone suggested otherwise. He handed the ID back but didn't step away. "What about your car?" he asked, jerking his chin toward the vehicle James had left down the road. "Why is it sitting back there?" "It overheated," James explained. "I was walking to the nearest town when I saw her. Figured I'd help." Danielle's eyes narrowed. "I'm going to check it out. Can't be too careful." James clenched his jaw but nodded. "Go ahead." As Daniel strode back to his patrol car, Rachel stepped closer, her voice low. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to drag you into this." James shook his head. "It's not your fault," he said, though the knot in his chest didn't loosen. When Daniels returned, he looked irritated but said nothing more. After a brief, dismissive nod, he got back into his car and drove off, the siren's wail echoing in the distance. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Thank you for being patient," Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly. "That was uncomfortable." James gave her a small smile. "You get used to it," he said simply, though the words tasted bitter. As he returned to the car, his focus shifted back to the engine. Yet something felt off. There were items in the trunk that didn't belong, things that hinted at a deeper story. James hesitated but decided to stay quiet for now. He needed to understand more before drawing conclusions. For now, the sun blazed on, the desert a silent witness to the unfolding story. James couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was the beginning of something much larger than a broken-down car. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, painting the Sonoran desert in hues of orange and gold. James Carter wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing briefly at Rachel Bennett, who stood a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly as though trying to hold herself together. The encounter with Officer Daniels still hung in the air, an unsettling reminder of the prejudices James had grown all too familiar with. But there was something else, a tension that had nothing to do with the officer. As James worked on the alternator, he noticed Rachel glancing nervously toward the road, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress. She seemed distracted, even frightened, and James couldn't ignore it. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his tone light but probing. Rachel blinked as though startled out of a daze. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. James nodded but didn't press further. He wasn't one to pry. People usually opened up to him when they were ready. Still, a nagging sense of unease gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Something about Rachel's demeanor didn't quite match the story she'd told him earlier. After a few more adjustments, James stepped back and wiped his hands on a rag. "That should do it," he said. "Try starting it now." Rachel slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. Relief washed over her face as she stepped out of the car. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." James offered a modest smile. "Happy to help. You should be good to make it to Tucson now." But just as he was about to pack up his tools, a faint sound reached his ears, the low rumble of an approaching car. James straightened, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward the road. A black SUV was speeding toward them, kicking up a cloud of dust in its wake. Rachel froze, her face draining of color. "Do you know them?" James asked sharply, his voice low. Rachel didn't respond immediately. Her breathing quickened, and she backed up a step, her wide eyes locked on the approaching vehicle. "It's him," she whispered, barely audible. "Him who?" James pressed, but the answer became clear as the SUV skidded to a stop a few yards away. The driver's door swung open, and a man stepped out, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a cold, calculating gaze. Two other men exited the vehicle as well, their movements deliberate and intimidating. James positioned himself subtly between Rachel and the newcomers, his muscles tensing. "Rachel," he said quietly, "what's going on?" Her voice cracked as she spoke. "That's one of my husband's men. They found me." James's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. The items in Rachel's trunk, her nervous glances, her vague explanations, it all made sense now. She wasn't just a stranded motorist. She was running from something or someone dangerous. The lead man approached, his eyes flicking dismissively over James before settling on Rachel. "Rachel," he said, his tone cold and mocking. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble. You know that." Rachel's voice shook as she stepped closer to James. "I'm not going back," she said, her words defiant but laced with fear. "Tell him I'm done." The man chuckled darkly. "You don't get to decide that." James squared his shoulders, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know what this is about, but you're not taking her anywhere." The man's eyes shifted to James, his expression hardening. "And who are you supposed to be?" "The hero." He stepped closer, his posture radiating menace. "You don't want to get involved in this, buddy. Trust me." James didn't flinch. Years of dealing with difficult customers and tense situations had taught him how to hold his ground. "She doesn't want to go with you," he said evenly. "That's all I need to know." The man's smile faded, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eye. He motioned to the others, who began to spread out, flanking James and Rachel. The tension was suffocating, the desert air heavy with the unspoken threat of violence. James's mind worked furiously, weighing his options. He wasn't armed, and he didn't know how far these men were willing to go. But one thing was clear: Rachel was terrified, and she wasn't going anywhere willingly. He couldn't abandon her now. "Rachel," James said under his breath, keeping his eyes on the men. "Get in the car." "What?" she whispered, her voice panicked. "Just do it," he insisted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Rachel hesitated for only a moment before scrambling into the driver's seat. James moved to block the men's path, his stance unwavering. "Leave her alone," he said firmly. "This doesn't have to get ugly." The lead man sneered. "You're making a big mistake." James didn't respond. He could hear the car door slam behind him, the engine revving to life. The men hesitated, their focus split between James and the escaping vehicle. It was the opening James needed. He lunged forward, shoving the lead man back with all his strength before turning and sprinting toward his own car. The men shouted in anger, but James didn't look back. He jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut as he turned the key. The engine sputtered for a heart-stopping moment before roaring to life. "Hold on," he yelled to Rachel as he floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward onto the open road. The SUV roared to life behind them, its headlights blazing as it gave chase. The desert stretched out endlessly ahead of them, the horizon painted in fiery shades of orange and red. The chase was on, and James knew there was no turning back now. The tires of James Carter's car screeched against the sun-baked asphalt, sending dust flying as he pushed the vehicle to its limits. The black SUV loomed behind them, its engine roaring like a predator closing in on its prey. Beside him, Rachel Bennett clutched the door handle, her knuckles white, her face pale with fear. "They're not going to stop," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "Neither will I," James replied, his eyes locked on the road ahead. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, each muscle in his body taut with determination. He wasn't a fighter by nature, but he'd spent his life solving problems. And right now, the problem was survival. The desert stretched out endlessly before them, a barren landscape offering little cover. James's mind raced. He needed a plan, something to buy them time or throw their pursuers off their trail. "There's an old service road up ahead," Rachel said suddenly, pointing to the left. "It's rough, but it might slow them down." James nodded, barely sparing a glance at her. "Hold on," he warned, yanking the wheel sharply. The car veered off the main road onto the narrow, uneven track. The tires skidded on the loose dirt, and the car bucked violently as it hit potholes and rocks. Behind them, the SUV followed, its larger frame handling the terrain with ease. The service road wound through a series of rocky outcroppings, the jagged formations casting long shadows in the fading light. James spotted an opportunity, a tight turn ahead, flanked by boulders that could obscure their path. He floored the gas pedal, pushing the car into the turn at full speed. The SUV, caught off guard, overshot the curve, its tires skidding dangerously close to the edge of a steep drop. "Good move," Rachel said, her voice breathless with adrenaline. "It's not over yet," James replied grimly. The narrow road opened into a dry riverbed, the terrain even rougher than before. James slowed slightly, navigating the dips and ridges with care. The SUV reappeared in their rearview mirror, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. "We can't outrun them forever," Rachel said, her voice laced with desperation. "There's got to be another way." James's jaw tightened. He glanced at her, noting the fear in her eyes and the way her hands trembled. "Is there anything in the trunk that can help?" he asked. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "There's a flare gun." James's eyes flicked to her briefly. "A plan forming. When I say so, grab it. We're going to make them regret chasing us." Rachel nodded, her fear momentarily replaced by resolve. She reached into the back seat, fumbling for the release latch that would give her access to the trunk. Meanwhile, James spotted a cluster of boulders ahead and guided the car toward them. "Now!" James barked. Rachel scrambled into the trunk, pulling out the flare gun just as the SUV drew closer. Its occupants had grown bolder, the vehicle swerving dangerously as they attempted to force James off the path. He braked hard, the sudden deceleration catching the SUV off guard. It swerved to avoid a collision, giving Rachel the opening she needed. She leaned out the window and fired the flare. The projectile soared through the air, trailing bright red sparks before slamming into the SUV's windshield. The driver jerked the wheel instinctively, and the SUV skidded sideways, its momentum carrying it into a SH. James didn't wait to see the outcome. He gunned the engine, the car surging forward as they left the chaos behind. Rachel collapsed back into her seat, the flare gun slipping from her grasp. "Did we lose them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," James said, though his grip on the wheel didn't loosen. Hours later, the desert gave way to the faint outlines of civilization. The lights of Tucson flickered in the distance, a beacon of hope after the harrowing ordeal. James pulled the car into a small roadside diner parking lot, cutting the engine as silence enveloped them. Rachel turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You saved my life." James shook his head, his expression serious. "You're not safe yet," he said. "You need to go somewhere he can't find you. Do you have a plan?" Rachel nodded hesitantly. "I have a contact near the border, a shelter for women like me. They can help me disappear." James sighed, leaning back against the headrest. "Good," he said, "but you need to be careful. People like him don't give up easily." Rachel reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I owe you everything. James, you didn't have to help me, but you did." "Why?" James met her gaze, his voice soft but firm. "Because no one should have to live in fear. And because I know what it feels like to be judged, to be trapped by something beyond your control. You deserved a chance to get out." Rachel's lips trembled, and she gave him a faint smile. "You're a good man." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the horizon, where the first rays of dawn were beginning to break through the darkness. "Be safe, Rachel," he said finally, "and don't look back." Rachel nodded, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer before she stepped out of the car. She gathered her belongings and began walking toward the diner, where she'd arranged for a ride to the shelter. James watched her go, his heart heavy but his conscience clear. As the sun rose over the desert, James started the car and pulled back onto the road. The horizon stretched out before him, endless and full of possibility. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: he'd done the right thing. And for now, that was enough.